Hello, welcome to Man with a Mentor. I am the man, your host, Matthew Barnard, and you may be noticing this is a little bit different of an episode. I'm doing it via Zoom with my guest, Paul Guay. But before I say hello to Paul, I'm just going to explain what Man with a Mentor, the show, is about. And basically, it's about talking to people who had an early vision of what they wanted to do with their lives, and they just pursued it until they got it, and they're doing it and loving life. That's what it's all about. Right, Paul?
That is right, Matt. That's all true.
I'm going to introduce you, Paul, as a writer, actor, director, teacher, mentor, and script consultant. That's a lot of titles. Can you give a couple up? Let somebody else in.
There wasn't room for pole dancer, which is probably the thing I do best and I'm most proud of, but I'm happy with those.
Right. Yeah, we were both Chippendales. I think that's how we met.
I think that was it.
Yeah, so you co-wrote the movie Liar Liar with Jim Carrey, also Universal Pictures' The Little Rascals, Heartbreakers with Gene Hackman and Sigourney Weaver and Jennifer Love Hewitt, and you co-polished DreamWorks' Mousehunt and The Neverending Story. I kind of encapsulated all that.
I did.
All right. I want to talk about The Neverending Story because that might be one of my favorite 80s movies as a kid, because I was 13 or something, or 12 when it came out. So it was right in that wheelhouse of fantasy fun. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was also 13 or 12 when it came out, Matt, just so your audience.
Right. And I'm just wondering when the notion of writing or crafting or creating films, when it hit you and when you thought I'm really good at this. Did you go through a time when you looked at early drafts of things and you were like, oh, I don't know, or did you just know immediately I'm killing it here?
I don't know if I've ever had that feeling. I was a writer at an early age. For Christmas or birthday presents, I might give my parents a short story or a poem or something like that. So I started writing at an early age. I wrote plays. And eventually, I'd fallen in love with movies as a kid, and it seemed like it would be a great thing to tackle. So I wrote a couple with various people, and then I hooked up with a particular partner, and we started working together. And there's a lot of screenwriting that is joyful. Coming up with the idea can be a ton of fun. Writing dialogue is always a blast. It's working out the story that is really challenging. So I never really had a problem thinking that the dialogue wasn't going to work or the characters weren't going to work. But the challenge for me was always, once you have an idea, how do you translate that into a story so that the idea lives up to the promise of the premise? And that's hard, and that takes a lot of work. And I'm way better at it than I used to be, but I don't think I'm king of the mountain there either.
You talked about growing up a little bit, when you were just a little Paul. What attracted you to writing as opposed to math or science, or how did you gravitate towards that? Did you have people that saw that and pushed you forward in the right career and were supportive, or did you have brothers and sisters and they were more the normal routes for career and professions? How did it play out as a family?
Well, I have an older brother, and he's more of a math and science guy than I am. I loved reading. I still love reading. I'm reading all the time. So I think early on the desire to tell stories was there. I wanted to be able to do for other people what great writers had done for me. So I started writing at a very early age. And when I went to high school, there was a teacher there who noticed my interest and started a creative writing class for me. And I was the only person in the class for 3 semesters, second semester of my junior year and all my senior year. And within those 3 semesters, I gave him over 1,000 poems and short stories and lyrics and things like that. And it was great because he didn't analyze the writing particularly. What he did was he read it and he gave me kind of general feedback. And the notion that I had somebody who I respected and looked up to and who I had a number of tastes in common with, for example, the Three Stooges and Boris Karloff, was great. And it meant that I kept writing. So I didn't just have my mother and my dad giving me positive reinforcement, although they did do that, but it was also somebody else. It was an adult that I respected who was a great teacher. So that helped a lot. And then I went to college and I majored in English and philosophy. And I took all the creative writing courses there. And the feedback was basically, well, you turn in a lot of work and you take it seriously. You may not be particularly good at this, was sort of the overall feeling. I had one of my creative writing teachers was a poet who said, you're intelligent, but it doesn't come through in your writing. And at the time I was irked by that. And now I kind of cherish that because A, it's very funny. And B, it was true at the time because I could put stuff down on paper, but I didn't really know how to edit it and shape it to the way that I hope I do now. So there was some encouragement and some kind of not encouragement in the early years. But I think at a certain point I developed a fairly thick skin. So while we would all love our work to be greeted with praise and joy and hosannas, you understand that's not going to happen, especially in the film world, where you pretty much have to have a thick skin in order to survive.
Like, how did you go from like college to thinking like, I'm going to move to LA and write scripts? Or were you kind of starting that along the way and then you just knew like, this is for me?
Teaching was kind of a seductive idea because I'd had a number of really good teachers that I looked up to and I appreciated the art of teaching. But, and you know, I didn't know any professional writers. I didn't know anybody in the film business. I didn't know any screenwriters. So after I graduated from college, I went back home for about 9 months, got a job that just kind of paid the rent. And then I figured I've got to give this a try. And I moved to Southern California, to Los Angeles. And I got a job at a film distribution company called Producers Sales Organization. And it eventually moved into production. And I was working in marketing and advertising and publicity there. And it was the best possible exposure to screenplays. We got hundreds of screenplays over the transom while I was there. So I read tons of stuff. And my jobs included writing synopses, writing taglines, writing log lines, occasionally writing trailers for films. So I had an idea of what I sort of developed my taste while reading. What do I like? What don't I like? What bores me? What turns me on as a writer? I would see that different people would have the exact same idea, so I would get less precious about ideas. I would actually see scenes recur in various screenplays where the alien is on Earth meeting the teenager for the first time. And if you're not in the business and you've written a screenplay and you see that in somebody else's screenplay, you think, I've been ripped off. But if you've read hundreds of screenplays, you realize, no, there's a lot of ideas that are in the air and there's a lot of commonality. And it's very hard to write something that nobody has ever seen before. So I had 5 years of exposure to the business and the idea of what attracts an audience and how can we maximize that? How can we choose screenplays and reshape them to some extent so that they are as audience friendly as possible? And then how do we sell them to an audience? How do we convince an audience that we have something that's going to give them 2.5 or 2 hours of joy? So all of that was extremely helpful.
Right. Your films are frequently hilarious. And I think you're known as a comic film writer. I mean, would you say that?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Right. But there's always a through line of like morality or a lesson learned. It's not just like comedy to be comedy. It has heart. How do you get that in there, like, and balance like heart with comedy without it being like schmaltzy or not funny enough? Like, how do you, that's a genius balance, I think, that you create within your work.
Well, I love that you use the genius word because I never hear that quite enough. So I was lucky to study writing with Danny Simon, who was the older brother of Neil Simon, who was the most prolific and one of the most successful comedy playwrights in history in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Danny had been the writing partner of his younger brother, Neil, for many years. They worked for Sid Caesar and other people like that. And Danny's theory of comedy was that good comedy has all the requirements of drama, plus it has to be funny. So you're not just going for the joke. You're going for the truth of the character, the integrity of the story. You're going for real people in believable situations who are being put through traumatically hilarious situations, not hilarious to them, but hilarious to us. And you've got to care about them, and you've got to care about what it is that they care about. And one of his rules was, you never violate the believability of the situation for a joke. If you have the best joke in the world, but your character wouldn't say it or it wouldn't happen, don't do it, because then you're breaking your trust with the audience. The audience no longer has a reason to trust you. So that was very helpful. And when my partner and I were writing Liar, Liar, we did a number of different drafts. And the first draft that we wrote, we thought was really funny, and we turned it into Imagine, the production company. And they said, hey, this is really funny. We really like it. Now we'd like to have more heart in the screenplay. So the second draft, we went in the direction of more heart. We looked at the father-son relationship, the ex-wife, ex-husband relationship. We looked at the pain that the father was causing the child because he keeps letting him down. And turned in the second draft, and Imagine said, this is even better. We'd like to do a third. We want more of that. So we did a third draft that had tons of heart. And meanwhile, I have no problem with heart, but I'm missing some of the more outrageous comedy that we initially had. Right. So then Jim Carrey comes aboard, and they said, hey, can you guys do broad comedy? And we're going, yeah, I think we could probably manage that.
I'm just wondering, because you talk about revisions and all that. Like, do you have every plot point kind of in your mind? Like, some people do it on cards, some people, swap things in and out and all that. Like, how do you go through the process, and how do you adapt to changes without making a change that like ripples through the whole thing and causes like problems from the get-go to the end, and that like those little changes can become so big that it's a mammoth task to like then fix the whole thing?
So there's a number of good questions there. The first screenplay I wrote as a kid, it was a subject matter that mattered to me and would matter to nobody else on Earth. So I started with a premise that had no possible audience, and I didn't realize that at the time because I wasn't analytical. I was very subjective. And I didn't have an outline. I just started writing. I was handwriting. And about halfway through, which is 40 to 50 handwritten pages, I realized this is going nowhere. I don't know who these characters are. I don't know what they want. And at some point, I probably realized, hey, there's no chance this will ever get made because, again, nobody cares about what these characters care about. So subsequently, as a writer and as a teacher, I come at it from a different point of view. The first thing is I've got to have a premise that I love, that I think I can execute well, and that I think there's an audience for. And if I don't think there's an audience, I should be writing a poem or a short story. I shouldn't be spending 12 weeks or 12 months of my life on a screenplay. So once I've settled on a premise that I think I love, I can execute, and there's an audience for, I start brainstorming, and this will take weeks. It's like, given this premise, what does this lead to? Who's the main character? What's his problem? What are his relationships? Does he have kids? Does he have a wife? Does he have a job? What does he do? What does he want? What's been missing in his life up until now? What's going to fulfill his life? What's going to prevent him from getting what he wants? And all of this stuff in retrospect seems so obvious, but until you've done it, you don't know where the story's going, or I don't know. So I'm brainstorming for literally weeks, and I'm going over many possibilities because given the premise, I don't want anybody else to come along and come up with a better story and say, why didn't you have them do this? Why didn't they do this? So I want to make sure that I've gotten all the possibilities of the premise down on paper. And then I structure the outline. So I've got an act 1, I've got an act 2, I've got an act 3. I've got good endings for my acts, and everything is building and building and building. So I'm a fiend for outlining. And in my experience as a reader and as a screenwriting teacher and as a script consultant, most people don't want to spend the time outlining. They'd like to come up with a great idea and jump into beginning the screenplay. And I get that because that's the fun stuff. The hard stuff is, what is the story? What is this about? Who cares? Who's my main character? What is he faced with? So that all takes a lot of time. In terms of notes, there's 3 types of notes. There's good notes, which will improve the screenplay, and occasionally one gets them. There are notes where it doesn't really matter if it doesn't really improve or disimprove the screenplay. So of course you should do those if you're being paid for it. And then there are notes that that won't help the screenplay, that will hurt the screenplay, and some of them are fatal. So if it's a fatal note, you have to find a political, kind way to say to the person who's given it. You have to figure out, what is the person objecting to? What is it that's not working in your story for that reader? And even if their suggestion as to how to fix it is wrong, the fact that they had a bump, that they had a problem at a certain point, that's not wrong. There's something that's not working for them. So the challenge is to come up with an alternative way of fixing it that's not going to ruin the screenplay, and then sell it to the person who's employed you to make the change.
Right. I wanted to ask you something about how you feel about the difference between creating and conceiving like your own film idea from scratch and polishing like someone else's work. Like, is doing your own thing from scratch more fulfilling or more frustrating, or do you like polishing? And can you polish something within like a week or two, or do they give you more time than that? And how does it work? And have you ever read something that they ask you to polish and you're like, I can't polish this unless I like gut it? Or do you polish things and add jokes and quips and things in it that only affect it in a minor way? Like, what do you consider under the terms of polishing?
Yeah, it's a good question. If I could make a living solely writing original screenplays, spec screenplays, I would love to do that, because by definition, the things I'm choosing to write about are the things that matter most to me, or I wouldn't have chosen them. But there are almost no screenwriters who can do that. Unfortunately, most work is in rewriting, pretty much rewriting other people's work. So I'm very close, obviously, to the stuff that I've originated myself. But when my partner and I were working together, I would turn stuff down because I didn't resonate with the subject matter, or the subject matter didn't resonate with me. So I've got to care about it, because I'm going to be spending a significant number of weeks on a rewrite or on a polish, and it matters to me that I care about it. So there would be an emotional connection, even if I'm just doing a polish. And the nature of a polish can really vary from project to project. On the Neverending Story, I had 36 hours to do a polish of the screenplay, because the company I worked for, Producer Sales Organization, had gotten the screenplay from Wolfgang Peterson, I think it was, and Herman Weigel, and it read like it had been translated from the original German that morning, because it had been. And my company wanted to take it out to American distributors so that we could raise money to finance the film. And I was asked, do you want to do a pass at the screenplay? Do you want to do a polish? And I said, sure. And I figured I'm going to have 2 weeks. And they said, you've got 36 hours. And I said, great. So, you do what you can in 36 hours. And that turned out to work. A couple hours into the polish, I was called into the office of the president, and all of the top brass of the company were sitting there, and they said, we want you to read what you've written so far. And I said, you mean read it aloud? And they said, yes, that would be helpful. So I read them the first however many pages I had, and they actually burst into applause, Matt, which has never happened before, never happened since, and will never happen again in my life. But I've been chasing that moment ever since. So then I completed the polish, and we wound up setting the project up with Warner Brothers. And if it hadn't been polished, it would not have been bought. But that doesn't mean that my polish was the magic that made it happen. But maybe. So that's a 36-hour polish. There's another project, Mousehunt, which you mentioned, where my partner and I were hired for 3 weeks of work. And we did a ton of work in those 3 weeks, and they wound up using 3 of our jokes. So I think we were the highest paid joke writers in Hollywood for those 3 weeks, basically.
So you've had great success, and say a young person came to you and said, I kind of want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of like good advice, something that you could do that might take your career in a bad direction, and maybe just like something ugly to avoid altogether. Like, what would you say were a couple of things to definitely do along that career path?
Okay, so I would do the opposite of what I did. I would go to film school. But before going to film school, I would pick up a camera and I would start shooting. I knew nothing about directing. I always figured that's what other people do. I would have started out, if I started out again, I would start out as a writer-director, not just as a writer. And I would be making movies. I'd be making short movies. I'd be getting them out there. I'd be getting feedback from a very young age. And then when I was old enough, I would go to film school, because you can learn so much from intelligent professors who have done this before. You can learn from your classmates what to do and what not to do, and you can constantly get feedback. And it's very important to get feedback. For young writers especially, there's a tendency to think that all of their ideas are gold, all of their screenplays are gold, all their dialogue is gold. And I'm sure that's the case for some writers. It definitely wasn't the case for me. So it's very helpful to get feedback from a number of perspectives. So I would highly recommend that. A bad thing to do, I belong to several screenwriting groups on Facebook. One is called Screenwriting, and I think there are 85,000 members, and about 10 of them are professionals. And I'm not saying that to be insulting. I'm saying that's probably the ratio. And the amount of bad advice that young screenwriters who don't know anything about the business give each other is astonishing. So I would try to find a way, if I'm a young writer, to find out who should I be listening to, which doesn't mean that person is right all the time. It means who generally knows what they're talking about. I would read tons of screenplays. A lot of writers don't read screenplays. And I would read books about screenwriting. And if I get one piece of good advice from a book about screenwriting, that's great. That's going to help me. So I would be very conscious of the fact that it's a tough, demanding field to go into. It's incredibly competitive. So one should have a thick skin. One should love and be passionate about what one is doing, but also be able to look at it objectively, to stand outside what one is doing and make sure that you're communicating what it is that you think you're communicating. It's remarkable in class to see writers who think that they've said something and they haven't, it's still in their head, or who don't think they've said something and they have, then they weren't aware of what was on the page. So it's important to, while you're writing, you're going to be wearing your childlike hat of enthusiasm and creativity and love, and let's try this. And when you're revising, you're going to be wearing your adult engineering Mr. Spock hat of, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't fit, and you have to have both hats, but you can't wear them at the same time.
Do you think, because there was big strikes last year, do you think the industry now is like even harder to crack? Or do you think it's always been something that's like just a lucky fate? Or like, how do you feel about where things are moving towards? Do you feel like there's more opportunities for more different voices and different people? Or do you think it's tightening up and more people are maybe writing as a scriptwriter, but also having to have that second job, and because there's just, the money isn't there?
Another excellent question. So I think it's always been hard to break into the film business. It definitely was when I broke in, and I think it's significantly harder now. I think the business is going through a contraction. I think the streamers have been hemorrhaging billions of dollars because they've been chasing subscribers as opposed to return on investment, and I think that they're retrenching. I think the studios are getting really nervous. When Mission Impossible movies aren't making money, that's not a good sign. In some ways, the barriers to entry have lowered, in that you can shoot a film on your phone and get it on YouTube and show people. So it's easier to make something than it's ever been before in history. At the same time, because it's easier, there's more competition than ever before in history, because everybody else can shoot something on their phone. So the questions are, how do you stand out? There's an estimated 100,000 screenplays that are written in the United States every year. Last year or 2 years ago when I checked, there was something like 11 spec screenplays, which means screenplays that you wrote on speculation with nobody paying you for it, that were bought. So you have to look at those odds, and you've got to go, what's the smart way how can I leverage my talent to break into the film industry? In terms of, I think you mentioned luck or numbers or something like that, or else I hallucinated it. But I think you have to have a number of things going your way to break in. One is, it probably doesn't hurt to be talented. Another is, you've got to work really hard. The third is, you've got to work really smart. You've got to think about it from the perspective of financiers and producers and directors and studio executives, how can I give them what they want and make sure that it's something that I want as well? And how can I get to them? How can I attract their attention through short films or through festivals or through contests or through pitching competitions or through query letters? How can I break through? So there's a number of things that have to go right. I mean, luck never hurt a person. So you should be aware of that going in. And that's one reason why I would say, if you don't love it, if you're not passionate about it, find something else, because it's a really, really tough way to make a living.
Right. Do you want to talk about social media? Like, if people want to be able to find you or your work, or like, do you have those things out there?
You can Google Paul Guay script consultant and get to my website.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Do you want to say what you're doing right now, or can you not speak on such things?
I can't be too specific. I will say that I just completed a horror comedy spec that I wrote with a partner, and we're about to send that out into the world and see what happens. And I'm working on another spec that's based on a true story, a really bizarre incident that happened about 4 years ago, that a friend and I simultaneously read the news story and talked to each other and said, this would make a great movie. And we're turning that into a screenplay right now.
All right. I'll ask one more screenplay related question. Do you like when you have something to adapt from, like the Neverending Story? Like, clearly there's a book that they got the majority of the ideas from and then condensed it and pulled what they wanted to out of it to create that movie. And you just mentioned kind of a real event, so you would clearly be using those facts and things that happened to create, at least initially, the initial concept of that film. Do you like having that for you, like ready to go, or do you prefer to just concocting all the jumbled things in your head and forming them into, you know what I mean?
Yeah. They're both fun, and they have different challenges. Neverending Story you mentioned, so that book already existed, obviously. When my partner and I were hired to write The Little Rascals, one of the things that we did is we watched a number of the Little Rascals shorts with Penelope Spheris, the director, and we selected scenes that we wanted to reference or copy or whatever. And that screenplay we had 12 days to write, because the rights to the characters were about to expire. And Amblin, who had optioned them, basically said, when we see your screenplay, we're going to know whether we're going to renew the rights or not. So you've got 12 days to turn it in. So that's encouraging, because you have to kind of move. And the great thing about the Rascals is the characters are so well defined that you're not trying to figure out who they are. You know who Spanky and Alfalfa and Darla are if you've watched The Little Rascals. So that's easy to write in a way. There's one or two novels that I've adapted where it helps to have a lot of the story in place already. And I've also written 2 biopics where I researched the lives of the people involved extensively. In one case where the guy was still alive, interviewed him for 2 days, interviewed a bunch of people who knew him. And that was fun, trying to construct a 3-act story with a beginning, middle, and end about a real person without violating the integrity of what happened to him. So it's fun. It's a different challenge than coming up with everything yourself.
Well, I am going to wrap it up by saying thank you so much, Paul Guay, for being here and chatting with me about your career and all the various successes you've had in entertainment. I appreciate it. And anyway, I'm going to say goodbye. And I want to thank everyone here for watching Paul Guay and myself on another episode of Man with a Mentor.